In Chief Architect, there are two different types of dimensioning tools. If we go up here to the CAD drop-down menu, you can see the dimension tools. These are your manual dimensions, and you have automatic dimensions. In this video, we'll discuss the automatic dimensions. You can also find your automatic dimensions parent tool in your toolbar. Just look for the icon with the letter A. Under your automatic tools parent tool, you have three different tools that you can use in floor plan view: the auto exterior dimensions, auto interior dimensions, and the NKBA auto dimensions. If I click on the auto exterior dimensions, Chief will create a complete set of dimensions around the outside of the building. The objects that your automatic dimensions are dimensioning to are set up in your defaults. If we go to the Edit drop-down menu to Default Settings and go to the Dimension Tools, if I double-click on Auto Exterior Dimensions and go to Locate Objects, here is where you can control what your automatic dimensions will dimension to. The walls will be located at their Walls Dimension layer, which is typically the framing layer or structural layer of the wall. You can change that to dimension to the surfaces of the wall, the siding or the drywall. You also have different options for your interior walls. You can dimension to the interior wall centers, the primary side, or to both sides of the interior walls. You can also dimension to your openings, your doors and windows. Right now it's set to dimension to their sides. You can dimension to their casings, centers, or rough openings. If you don't want your automatic dimensions to locate your windows at all, you can simply uncheck all of the boxes. These default settings will only affect the automatic exterior dimensions. Other default settings that determine what these dimensions will look like are set up in the General Dimension Default settings and will depend on which of the saved dimension defaults are currently active. Here in the Save Dimension Default settings, we can see here that the 1/4 inch dimension defaults are active. If you want your dimensions to follow a different set of defaults, make sure to activate a different set before creating your automatic exterior dimensions. Right now they're set on the 1/4 inch scale dimension defaults. You can edit these defaults by clicking on the Edit button here. Setting dimension defaults is covered in more detail in another video. I'll go ahead and click OK here and accept the defaults as they are. Once you've created your automatic exterior dimensions, you can use them to move objects that are located in your design to the exact position you want. For instance, I'll select this window and then click on the dimension that I want to change, type in the exact dimension that I want, and it'll move the window. You can also move your walls by selecting the wall that you want to move, selecting a dimension that you want to move it to, and change the dimension. You can also edit the exterior dimensions once you've placed them. If you select the dimension, you can use the square move edit handle in the direction indicated by the arrows. I can move this dimension line to the right or to the left as indicated by the arrow. If I try to move it up or down on my screen, it won't move. You can also edit the extension lines. If I click on the dimension line and then select one of these diamond-shaped edit handles, you can remove it by simply clicking and dragging it away from the dimension line. You can move an extension line by selecting that diamond-shaped edit handle and move it to the position where you want it. You can add additional extension lines by selecting this dangling diamond edit handle next to the Move edit handle. Click and drag it to an object that you want to dimension to. A quick way to remove all of the automatic dimensions is to activate your Manual Dimension tool. Then hold down your Shift key and click and drag a box around all of the dimensions. With the Dimension tool active, it'll only select dimensions on your screen. Then you can delete them by using your Delete Objects tool. Another automatic dimension tool you can use is your Auto Interior Dimensions. When I click on the Auto Interior Dimensions, you'll notice that it places a lot of dimensions, and some of them are repeated inside of a room. For instance, in this area, I have two dimensions that dimension the width of the room. What these dimensions are doing is dimensioning the length of this wall inside of the room and the length of this invisible wall inside of this room. The 8'4" is dimensioning from here to the invisible wall on this wall, and this 8'4" is dimensioning from here to the invisible wall on this side. Again, you can remove dimensions that you don't want by simply selecting them and deleting them. Or you can change the location of your extension lines by using the diamond-shaped edit handles. If I go to the default settings and back to the dimension defaults, you can see here that I have auto interior dimensions. Again, you can set up the way your auto interior dimensions locate different objects inside of the building. You can also change the setting for the minimum room size that the automatic interior dimensions will measure. For instance, I have a small bathroom and a small closet here. If I set my minimum area to 100 square feet and then delete the dimensions and regenerate them, you can see now that there are no dimensions generated inside of these two rooms that are smaller than 100 square feet. You can also place automatic interior dimensions inside of one room at a time. I'll go ahead and delete all of these dimensions, and then instead of clicking on the button for the automatic interior dimensions to place dimensions in all of the rooms, I'll select the room that I want to place the dimensions in, and then you'll see your automatic interior dimension tool down here. When I click, it'll place the interior dimensions only in that one room. You also have some automatic elevation dimensions. I'll go ahead and delete the dimensions that we've created here, and then take a cross-section elevation of the building. Here in an elevation view, I'll go back to my automatic dimension tools and find my auto elevation dimensions. The auto elevation dimensions will locate objects again according to the defaults that are set up for the auto elevation tool. I'll go ahead and click undo, and then we'll take a look at a different kind of elevation dimension, the auto story pole dimension. The auto story pole dimensions dimension the heights of different objects in your building using markers and dimension lines. Again, you have specific dimension defaults for the auto story pole dimensions. You can determine in these defaults if you want your dimension lines and markers to be on the left or the right or both by checking both boxes. You can also add auto elevation dimensions across the top of the building or across the bottom. You can also add the inner dimensions, which is this dimension line here, or dimensions between the elevation markers, which is this dimension line here. If I uncheck both of these boxes and regenerate my auto story pole dimensions, it'll regenerate just the markers and labels and their heights without any dimension lines. You also have other settings in your auto story pole dimension defaults for the format of the dimension lines, the marker format, the locate object settings for the elevation dimensions, as well as the locate elevation settings to determine which of the heights you want to call out with your markers and labels. You can add available markers or remove the marks to include by selecting them in the list and clicking on Remove. Again, the dimension defaults are covered in more detail in additional online training videos. Now I'll go ahead and close this exterior elevation, and we'll take a look at a different type of automatic dimension tool. So now I have added all of my cabinets and my fixtures for my kitchen design. And here I'm going to take an interior elevation with my wall elevation tool. I'll select this camera, place it right in the middle of the kitchen, and click and drag toward the wall that I want to see in this wall elevation. Now there's a couple of automatic dimensioning tools that I can use while in elevation view. If I click on the drop down, I can use my auto elevation dimensions. That's going to place dimensions at the right side of my elevation view and at the bottom of my elevation view. But remember that my automatic dimensions are using the active dimension defaults. If I want to print this view at 1/2 inch scale, I'm going to want to change my active dimension defaults. To do that, we'll go up to the little white wrench, our default settings, come down to dimensions, and double click here on dimensions. At the bottom of this dialog, you can see the dimension defaults that are active right now, the 1/4 inch scale dimension defaults. We'll change this to 1/2 inch scale dimension defaults. And then we'll regenerate those automatic elevation dimensions. Now our dimensions are set to print properly at 1/2 inch scale. But we have one more tool that we can use for our automatic dimensions. But first, let's go ahead and delete these dimensions. I'll activate the dimension tool, and using the Active Tool Selection mode, hold down my Shift key and click and drag a box to select all of the dimensions, and hit the Delete key on my keyboard. Then I'm going to change my active dimension defaults again. We'll go to the Dimension Defaults, double click here, click on the drop-down and select my NKBA dimension defaults. The NKBA dimension defaults are also set to print at 1/2 inch scale, but they're set to locate objects and generate their extension lines according to NKBA standards. Now we'll go back to the automatic dimension tools and select our NKBA auto elevation dimensions. The NKBA standards will locate all of the fixtures by their center lines and locate all the cabinets at their sides. Again, once you've created automatic dimensions, you can edit them, either by selecting a dimension line, move it, or remove it completely by hitting your delete key on your keyboard. You can also edit the extension lines by selecting the dimension line and then using the small diamond edit handles on each object that it's locating, dragging them away from the dimension line. You can remove them, or you can add extension lines back by using the dangling diamond edit handle. So Chief has given us several tools that we can use for automatic dimensioning. Your floor plan view automatic dimensions, your auto exterior and auto interior dimensions, and the floor plan NKBA auto dimensions. And in an elevation view, we have the option for the auto elevation dimensions, the NKBA dimensions, and the auto story pole dimensions. The default settings for all of these tools are covered in more detail in additional videos.